Thank you for tuning into my channel. Don't forget to click on like and subscribe if you like what you see and you would like to be notified when I release future videos. In this video, this will be a walkthrough implementation of lab number 1, design and implement a virtual network in Microsoft Azure. In this particular scenario, we have our fictional organization, Contoso Ltd, that is in the process of migrating infrastructure and applications to Azure from its on-premises network. Now, your role as a network engineer will be to plan and implement 3 different virtual networks and subnets to support resources in those virtual networks. The 3 virtual networks of concern here are our core services virtual network. That core services VNet is going to be deployed into the US East region, and it's going to have the largest number of resources, and it's going to be in charge of managing connectivity to the on-premises networks through a VPN connection. The network will have web services, database, and other systems that are key to the operations of the business. Shared services such as domain controllers and DNS will also be located here. A large amount of growth is anticipated, so we're going to need a really large address space that's going to be required for this VNet. Our manufacturing VNet is the second virtual network. It will be deployed into the West Europe region near the organization's manufacturing facilities. It's going to contain systems for the operations of the manufacturing facilities, and we anticipate a large number of internal connected devices for their systems to be able to retrieve data from, such as temperature. So we're going to need an IP address space that it can expand into. And then finally, we have a small network here, our research VNet, which is going to be deployed into the Southeast region near the organization's research and development team. Now, the R&D team, they have a small stable set of resources that are not expected to grow. So they need a small number of IP addresses for a few virtual machines for their work. And here is an example topology diagram of what this would look like. Now, while the objective of this lab is to focus strictly on the deployment of virtual networks and subnets, ideally we would have our on-premises site with our own data center resources on-prem, and then this is indicated by the little building with the sun here. And then we have a VPN tunnel, which is acting as a site-to-site connection between the on-premises network and the Azure cloud platform. This VPN tunnel site-to-site provides us with an encrypted tunnel to allow communication between our on-prem network, on-prem site, and our Azure cloud resources. So in the Azure cloud, we have a hub and spoke topology here with our East US core services VNet acting as our hub. And we have 2 spoke VNets, one of which is the research VNet and the other which is in the manufacturing VNet. So some of this is extra information just to give us an idea of what this would look like in the real world and a real network implementation, but for now we will just focus on deployment of virtual networks and subnets. So here is the addressing information for our virtual networks, their regions, their virtual network address space, the names for their subnets, and the addressing space for the subnets that will be taken out of their virtual network address space. We have a set of tasks that we will need to complete in order to successfully deploy these virtual networks and subnets. A list of 5. We have resource group. Our resource group is important. It acts as a container for all of the resources that will live in our virtual network. We need to create core services VNet and subnets. Task 3, we need to create manufacturing VNet and subnets. Task 4, we will create the research VNet and subnets. And task 5, we are going to create, we're going to verify all of the VNets and subnets that were created here. So with that being said, let's begin. So to begin with our resource group creation, we can click in the top search bar in the Azure portal, and we will look for resource group, and we will select it from the drop down list, and then we will click on create to create a new resource group. We want to ensure that the applicable subscription that we intend to use is selected in the subscription field, And we want to populate the resource group name into the resource group field, in which case we're using Contoso resource group. Our region here that is selected by default is the one that we will use for this particular VNet. We will click on Review plus Create. No tags in our demonstration at this point. And we will click on Create to kick off the deployment of our resource group. And while that is doing its own creation thing, we're going to go ahead and move along to task number 2, in which case we want to create the core services VNet and the virtual network itself and the subnets that are needed here. So we will do that by searching for virtual networks in our global search list and select it from the drop-down list. We will click on virtual network, create virtual network, so that way we can create a virtual network. We want to ensure that our proper subscription is selected in the subscription field in the drop-down list. Next, we need to select the applicable resource group. In this case, I will click on the drop-down and we will select the resource group that was created for this implementation for Contoso resource group. Next, we need to give our VNet a name. And in this case, the name of this network is going to be our core services VNet. And the region will be deployed into the US East region. Next, we need to configure or create the IP address spaces for our VNet. So we're going to go ahead and click on Next. This takes us to Security tab. We need IP addresses, so we'll go ahead and click there. Here we have default VNet and subnet information that is provided to us. We can modify what is available here to suit our needs. For the Contoso Core Services VNet, we need an address space of 10.20.0.0/16. That will work. And we are going to need several different subnets. We have our gateway subnet. Gateway subnet is a dedicated subnet that will be utilized for the virtual network gateway that provides that site-to-site IPsec tunnel connectivity between the on-premises network and our Azure cloud resources. So we need the gateway subnet, we need our shared services subnet, we need a database subnet, and we need public web service subnet. So we'll go ahead and begin by clicking on subnets, add a subnet. And here we are going to take that subnet information, well, that address for that subnet is going to be taken from the IP address space of the virtual network. We'll go ahead and use the template that is for a virtual network gateway, because this gateway subnet is a dedicated subnet for the virtual network gateway. And the starting address is going to be 10.20.0.0, and we must use a /27 for a gateway subnet to provide it enough space. We do not yet have a virtual network gateway, but in a later lab we will learn how to deploy a virtual network gateway. That gateway is something different, used for network address translation. We're going to go ahead and click on Add. And here we can see our gateway subnet has been added. We'll go ahead and click on Add a subnet to add our next subnet. And here we are going to keep the same subnet default subnet template. This one is not going to be a special one. We're going to give it a name of Shared Services subnet. Our address space here is going to be 10.20.10.0/24. And we're going to go ahead and click on Add. Next, we'll go ahead and click on Add a subnet and create our next one, which is our database subnet. We will keep the default subnet template and we will name this database subnet with our address space of 10.20.20.0. And that's a /24 CIDR range. And we'll go ahead and click on add, and then finally we'll click on add a subnet to add one more subnet, and that's going to be our public web service subnet. We're going to go ahead and give it the name public web service subnet. The spelling isn't really critical for this type of subnet with the capitalization. However, where it is critical would be in places where those dedicated subnets are required, such as our gateway subnet. You are required to put that type of capitalization in the name for that subnet, gateway subnet, because Azure will be looking for that to be able to associate that subnet with the gateway once it is created. But for the public web service subnet, we'll just go ahead and proceed with what is called out in the lab guide. So that's 10.20.30.0. That's a /24 CIDR, giving us 256 IP addresses. And no, not all of them will be available for use. But we'll go ahead and click on add. And we have completed the addition of our core services virtual network subnets. We'll go ahead and click on review and create. And here's our address space. Here are our 4 subnets, and this is all for the core services VNet that will be hosted in the East US region. Click on create. And that will kick off the deployment of our core services VNet in the East US region. Now, next in task 3, we need to create our manufacturing VNet and its respective subnets. We will have 1, 2, 3, 4 different subnets that need to be created in our manufacturing VNet. So with that, let's begin. We will go back to our virtual network option, and we're going to click on create virtual network. Here we will make sure that our subscription is selected appropriately from the drop-down list, as well as our resource group. Everything in this deployment will be hosted in our Contoso resource group. Our virtual network name, this one will be called our manufacturing VNet, and the region will be Europe, West Europe. So we're looking for Europe, West Europe. We will click on next to configure our IP address space information for the manufacturing VNet. Our IP address space will be 10.30.0.0/16. I'm going to go ahead and copy that, and I will paste it here to overwrite what is in the default VNet address space here. Notice we got a red error here because the default subnet does not fall within the VNet address space of the VNet that I have configured here. But that's okay, because we're going to fix it in a second when we go ahead and modify this default subnet, so that way we can use it for the manufacturing system subnet. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and click on the edit pencil here on this default subnet, and this will pull out the pop-out pane, and we can make modifications here that as we need to. So we're going to go with the subnet template default. We're going to keep the default, and we're going to give this a name. The name of our subnet is manufacturing system subnet. Our address space here is going to be 10.30.10.0, 10.30.10.0, and that's going to be a /24 CIDR. And we don't need any other special security concerns here. We're going to go ahead and click on save. And that creates our manufacturing system subnet. We'll click on add a subnet to add a new subnet. And next we're going to create our sensor subnet. And the address space for our sensor subnet is going to be, and that's sensor subnet number 1, because we actually have a total of 3 sensor subnets. So this is number 1, and the IP address subnet range is 10.30.20.0/24. We don't need any special security considerations. We'll go ahead and click on add, and we're going to go ahead and click on add a subnet, because now we need to add sensor subnet number 2. I'm going to copy and paste that here. That's a default template, but the name of the subnet is sensor subnet 2. Our IP address for this subnet is 10.30.21.0/24. That looks good. We're going to go ahead and click on add. That gives us 3. We have one more. We're going to click on add a subnet here, final stretch, and we have sensor subnet number 3. That is the name of our subnet. We're going to paste that into the name field, and the address space here is 10.30.22./24. So this is 22.0/24. That looks good. We're going to go ahead and click on add, and finally we have 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 10.30.10.0. We have 10.30.20.0, 10.30.21.0, and 10.30.22.0. That all looks great. We're going to go ahead and click on review and create. This all looks great. We'll go ahead and click on create. And that kicks off the deployment of our manufacturing VNet. Finally, in task 4, we need to create our research VNet with the virtual network as well as its respective subnets. So we're going to go ahead and click on in our global search. We're going to go ahead and look for virtual networks again, and we're going to select virtual networks. You can see our 2 previously deployed VNets show up in the list here below. We'll click on create, so that way we can begin the creation of a new one. Select our subscription, select our applicable resource group. The name of our new virtual network is going to be our research VNet. I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste that to save a little bit of time. But there's our research VNet, and the region here is going to be Southeast Asia. So let me take a minute to find that in the list, Southeast Asia. I'm having a hard time finding it. Do you see it? Southeast Asia? Southeast Asia. Is this it? Yep, this looks like it. Asia Pacific, Southeast Asia. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and click on next. And we don't need any security enhancements at this point yet. We're just going to go to our IP addressing information here. And this particular VNet is going to have an IP address space of 10.40.0.0/16 for our CIDR. We'll go ahead and paste that in there. And for our subnet range, we have 10.40.0.0/24. This is taken from the VNet address space. So we have 10.40.0.0/24 CIDR. That looks good. We're going to go ahead and give it a name. It's going to be called our research system subnet. And that subnet actually, VNet actually only has one subnet. So that looks good. We're going to go ahead and click on save. Our subnet appears here. We'll click on review and create. And this all looks fantastic. We'll go ahead and click on create. And that will kick off the deployment of our final subnet, which is our research VNet. So finally, in step 5, task number 5, we are tasked with verifying the creation of our VNets and subnets. So we're looking to have a core services VNet with its respective subnets. We have our research VNet with its respective subnets, and we also have our manufacturing VNet with its respective subnets. So let's go ahead and take a look. We're going to look for virtual networks, and we can see that we have 3 different virtual networks here. We're looking for core services VNet, and in our core services VNet, we can under this blade we can scroll down under settings, and then click on subnets. And let's take a look at the subnets that we have here. Notice that we only have 251 available IPs, even though we saw 256 available IP addresses when we created these subnets. And that's because Azure actually reserves the first 5 addresses, host IP addresses of a subnet for special reasons. We'll get into that later, but let's just verify that we have our subnets that were needed here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Where's our diagram? We have our 5 subnets here. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm sorry, I cannot count. 1, 2, 3, 4 subnet. That looks good. That's for core services. Next, let's verify our next VNet. We have manufacturing VNet. Our manufacturing VNet, in the subnets settings, we have manufacturing system subnet. We have sensor subnet 1, 2, and 3. That all looks fantastic. That's exactly what we expected for our manufacturing system subnet. And then finally, we have our research VNet, which we're looking for one subnet. That will be called the research system subnet. So let's take a look. So research VNet and then our subnet. And that all looks fantastic. So we have successfully deployed the new virtual network and the respective subnets that will be needed for the Contoso Ltd Corporation to begin the migration of its infrastructure from its on-premises network to the Azure platform. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to click on like and subscribe to be notified of my future videos.